Yeah, the big sort begins in 2004 when Bob Cushing, my stat partner, and I began publishing some maps and in the Austin newspaper about U.S. counties becoming more politically homogenous. We could see that the red and blue maps that we see on the TV and CNN and MSNBC were meaningless. The real differences in American politics began at the community. And so we proposed that people were self-segregating, that they were self-selecting to be around others like themselves, and that, as George explained, as lifestyle and way of thinking aligned with politics, that those places were becoming increasingly either Republican or Democratic. And that's what was happening. Places would become Democratic, and then they become more Democratic. And you could see it in the data. In California, totally blue state, right? Well, 17 counties were becoming more Democratic in presidential elections. 30 counties were becoming more Republican, but only 11 were becoming more competitive over time since the mid-1970s. And that's really our nation. It's true that people have always clustered, but what caught our attention was that the clusters were getting bigger over time. And so we tried to find different ways of looking at it, and this is the big sort in 1976, Ford and Carter, right? And these are the counties where either Ford or Carter, in a very even election, won by 20 percentage points or more. And in 1976, about a quarter of the people lived in one of these landslide counties. And in almost a stair-step fashion, throughout those 30 years, more people began living in landslide counties. This is 2004, also a 50-50 election, essentially. And the gray counties are the Republican counties. Black counties are where Kerry won by 20 percentage points or more. And we had gone from 1976 having a quarter of people in landslide counties to 2004 having a half of the total population in a 50-50 election, living in a community where the election wasn't close at all. And we published this data, and people said, you're crazy. People don't look at voting records before they, move. What are you thinking of? How do they know? And they're right. I mean, when I moved to Austin from Kentucky, from Snack, I should say, not from Kentucky, to East Hummerland, my wife and I we didn't look up voting records. We drove around the city, and we ended up moving to the most Democratic precinct in the city. And so I began to wonder, we've talked about, how do you know? And one of my favorite ways of figuring out the politics of a place is what I now call the dog poll. And that happened when I went up in 2006 to vote at the South Congress Baptist Church. And I was taking photographs for a website that was collecting pictures of precincts all over the country. And I took a picture of this brown lab dog and the owner. And I said, what's the dog's name? And she said, oh, the dog's name is Che. And, it's not a scientific poll, but when a dog picked at random from a polling place is named from a South American dictator, a revolutionary, it's a sign that the party, that your neighborhood is sort of steering to the left. And so that was happening. The same time, my neighbors were doing a feng shui of the middle school. They had done a rice blessing and a smudging of the principal's office, and they're hanging the gongs. And so that describes a neighborhood like mine where in 2000, George Bush, hometown boy, came in behind both Al Gore and Ralph Nader in my neighborhood. So I think most of us have a certain kind of cultural literacy that tells us whether we're in the right spot. And so I put together, I think you can tell just by looking whether a place is Republican or Democratic. And to show you that this is true, I've done a few photographs here, and we start easily. I don't want nothing too hard. And this is my neighborhood. This is right around the corner. And then sometimes there are actual signs that tell you. And this is right around the corner. There's something about Democrats that like kind of weird yard art. And so all those 80, 90% Democratic, as you could probably guess. And, okay. Not much yard art. This is Scott County, Minnesota, 60% Republican. Okay, now this is an interesting one. This is Harlan County, Kentucky, and this was put up by Harrison Mays. Harrison Mays was this incredible guy. He had these ready to go to all the planets. His first piece of evangelical art was he wrote "Repent" on the side of a pig, and then released it on the main street of Middlesboro, Kentucky. But when this went in, this was a Democratic county, New Deal Democratic county. Now it's Republican because of the changes that George talked about. But if you think about it, you know, we see it in the wild, it's a sign of republicanism. But if you put that photograph and put a frame around it and put it on a wall, then you would know that you're in the house of a Democrat because it would become folk art. And so things are complicated. One block from where Molly Ivins lived. And her secular views sort of flowed downhill to the Travis Heights Elementary. And, okay, a different kind of vision of religion. And one of the ways you can tell a Republican place from a Democratic place is the distance between people. The denser the population, the higher the vote for Democrats. This is more, of course, a weird yard art, but this is Edina, which is a inner suburb of Minneapolis. And Edina had always voted Republican until 2004, and it was because of this part of Edina with the DIY Halloween art and the, you know, the Zorro mask on the dog that. Okay, this is not Vermont. I just want to let you know that this is Fayette County. This is one of my favorite counties in Texas, Fayette County, Texas. This is the St. John community. And just because, and 75% Republican, in case you want, and probably 110% Catholic. And just because I don't think you all probably have a lot of anti-abortion art in your neighborhoods, I include this next piece from Schulenburg, which is also in Fayette County. There's this incredible stainless steel sculpture of this in front of the KC Hall there in this is just for your edification. And okay, is this there a Republican precinct chair in suburban Dallas, or is this a comic book artist in the most Democratic precinct in Portland, Oregon? I don't, you know, I think you would know this was your neighbor. And Mason County, Texas, about 80% Republican. And what's interesting, rural places have a disproportionate number of people in Iraq, and you can see that here. Book people, Darwin Day. I don't know where they celebrate Darwin Day in Schulenburg, but that's where we do it in. Lewiston, Idaho, extra points for what JBS.org stands for. Very good. Extra, you get the bike. And so, now Bob and I didn't go looking for political difference. We were trying to figure out why some places were getting rich and some places were getting poor, and Austin was one of those places getting rich. And what we discovered was the sort that the communities were getting closer together after the war, and then beginning in the 1970s, they began to diverge. And one way to see that is with education levels. Okay, this is the distribution of people with college degrees in 1970. The orange means it's about the national average, and in fact, in 1970, people with college degrees were relatively evenly distributed around the country. But over the next 30 years, we sorted. And people with college degrees began to cluster in particular places. So Austin now has 47% of its adults with a college degree. Cleveland has 17%. It causes these incredible economic differences from place to place. Parts of my Kentucky have this incredible prescription drug abuse problem that is hard to believe. So we could see that there were the economic differences, educational differences, and Bob Cushing decided to see whether there were cultural differences. So we'd use some advertising data, and we could see these attributes of high-tech places. These are the 21 cities that produce the most technology and the most patents. And this is my neighborhood, you know, more likely to try anything once, and church attendance decreasing. So kind of crappy social, civic culture, and sort of individualistic, creative culture. Compared to the low-tech cities, more civic-minded, people going to church, spending time with their families, but terrible economies. And so we could see that there were these cultural differences on top of the economic and the educational ones. So we began to check the election results, and in 1980, the high-tech cities voted about the national average. In 2000, they voted 17% more Democratic than the national average. So you could see that in 2000, Al Gore carried the high-tech cities by 5.3 million votes, and Bush made up the margin almost in rural areas and low-tech cities. And the same thing happened in 2004. The real difference in American politics wasn't at the level of the state, but at the community and the neighborhood, and it was getting bigger. So we were separating by lifestyle, as George explains, and this is not by policy. We didn't move to be around people who believed about single-payer health care plans like we did. And one of those ways is spanking, corporal punishment. Mark Hetherington took George's idea about corporal punishment and related it to the vote. And in fact, the states that had the highest level of people who thought spanking was okay voted the highest for Republicans in 2004. Massachusetts had the lowest, had the weeniest parents, right? And they voted highest. Now, if you look at it another way, if you look at it in family formation, a demographer at the University of Michigan checked out cohabitation rates. Did you live together before you were married? And the graph is exactly the reverse. Massachusetts has the highest shacking rate and then the highest Democratic vote. So it was really two different ways of looking at life. And we've really divided physically in the neighborhoods, not necessarily where we look alike, but where we think alike, live alike, vote alike, spank alike, shack alike. And these homogeneous communities are really being recreated and reinforced in churches and in markets. And churches now are, anybody who knows who this guy is? There you go. Rick Warren runs Big Church. Churches now are among the most politically segregated institutions in the country, and they were created that way on purpose. Rick Warren built the large Saddleback Church, and he followed the advice of a missionary in India that a lot of the megachurch people do. In fact, most ministers do now. That churches should be built on the homogeneous unit principle. That people should be create their institutions, their churches for people, for a certain kind of person. They knew that to attract people, the people didn't want to come to church where they'd have to cross cultural boundaries or other kinds of barriers. And so Rick Warren, that's his target audience. Just like a Saddleback Sam, there's a Saddleback Samantha, so don't worry. He prefers the casual and informal over the formal. There's nothing about religion on here. It's all about lifestyle. And that's why Warren wears the flowered shirts, and why Obama and McCain, when they went for their interviews, they went tieless, because they knew Saddleback Sam, a tie made Saddleback Sam nervous. And that's what churches provide now. A place where people don't have to cross any boundaries, confront any differences in their church life. Religion is no longer about transforming lives. It's about catering to a certain kind of lifestyle. And that happens even within the church. This is Saddleback. There's an aloha service, and there's a service for singles. And the question in church now is, what is your style? So also, like attracts like in the church, and like also sells to like. There was a study in the insurance industry in the early 1960s. Tall, college-educated men sold best to other tall, college-educated men. Republicans sold best to Republicans, Democrats to Democrats. And these politics were fully brought into, I mean, these kinds of strategies were fully brought into politics in 2004. The Bush campaign was disappointed in its turnout in 2000, and they were trying to find what made people go out and vote. And what they found was that people knocking on doors, the individual canvasser was the best at getting someone out. But it needed to be a certain kind of person. It needed to be a neighbor or someone who was clearly from the same kind of social hive. And so that's what they did. They created this incredible neighbor-to-neighbor campaign so that the appeal came from someone who looked like you. And so the strategy was to reflect the voters' belief and ways of life back on themselves, so that the campaign, it wasn't so much about the re-election of a president, but the vote for a way of life. And it's interesting, this is part of the Obama campaign that they've picked up totally. Claire McCaskill, senator from Missouri, told a group of Obama organizing fellows that the message you've got to send more than any other message is that Barack Obama is just like us. And it's amazing to me how much of politics comes from the evangelical community. This is the way the megachurch organizes. The ministers don't get people to come to church. Friends get other friends to come to church. And Billy Graham, when he would have his altar call at the end of his services, if a young woman would come to the altar to give her life to Christ, she would be met by another young woman. A black man would be met by a black man. And so that the first vision that people have when they come into the community of the church is someone who looks just like them. So why does it matter that we gather in these like-minded communities? Well, like-minded communities over time become more extreme in the way that they're like-minded. And I think you can see that somewhat in the rather bitter campaign rallies that have been taking place. And I mean, there are all sorts of experienced French students who dislike America were put into a room. They're asked to talk about America for an hour or two. They came out of a room, they dislike America more. And another thing that's happening is that as we move into more homogeneous neighborhoods, our congressional districts are becoming more like lopsided. Most districts, like most counties, have tipped either Republican or Democratic, which means there's really no middle in Congress anymore. No Democrat now is more conservative than the most liberal Republican. There's no crossover, which makes consensus on issues nearly impossible, and so we really don't get any. Now, democracy is about meeting and coming. I think I can see a Golden Gate Bridge over there, I don't know. Is about meeting and coming to terms with people who look and talk and believe and think differently from ourselves. But that's not what we do these days. We congregate in these communities and churches and clubs of like mind. Manuel Castells says that when people find themselves unable to control the world, they simply shrink the world to the size of their community. And that's what we've done. We've created this country where there are greater differences coast to coast, from place to place, but fewer differences within the smaller groups where we actually live. So we have both more diversity in the country and more conformity at the same time. But what's missing is any sense of the whole. So thank you all.